This story begins by showing off the prestigious Sunyang Group worth trillions, with investments in almost everything you can think of. Hyunwoo, the story's protagonist, was a worthless country boy who somehow made it into the Sunyang Group, and his family celebrated him for conquering the genes of failure. He was assigned to the future strategic planning headquarters, but it was just a scam because he was essentially role-playing John Wick for the company. In all this, Hyunwoo maintained the grind to better his life until his position changed, and he became widely recognized, even by the royal family of Sunyang. 13 years later, Hyunwoo knew the dirtiest secrets of the Sunyang Group and finally earned their trust after so long. They went as far as entrusting 7 billion one of their secret funds into his personal account. Currently, he was on a trip ordered by one of the sons of the Sunyang Group, who instructed him to hide away in the Maldives until the cops had stopped investigating their company. Hyunwoo thought it was risky to entrust such a large sum to him, but the son said he could even trust Hyunwoo over his wife as he was the only one trustworthy enough to handle such funds. Whether or not Hyunwoo had ulterior motives, the Sunyang's trust was enough to give him the soft boy life. Later he arrived at the airport in the Maldives and was approached by some hitmen, who were workers in the secretary's office. This was rather surprising, and he asked why they were there, so they said it was the president who instructed them to assist him. However, that was absolute cap because his presence in the Maldives was a top-secret mission. But before he could say a word, one of the hitmen pulled out a gun and pressed it against his chest, saying he could quietly comply with their instructions from the president to assist him indefinitely. It was at that moment that Woo realized that 13 years of loyalty and slaving for that corporate job was all a scam. He asked to make a call to the president, but the hitman told him to think again because he was too low to question the president. Desperately, Woo said they could go ahead and beg the president to allow him to finish the job and he'll flee to a distant country forever. The other thug told him to shut the crap up and consider his wife and parents because the royal family promised to heavily compensate his parents while the CEO would take good care of his wife. Woo knew this was crap because, after blaming the corruption on him, it was highly unlikely that they'd treat his family nicely. Now, neither would he get retirement benefits, nor would they leave him a penny if the cops seized his properties. After a while, the car stopped at a forest in the middle of nowhere, and Woo knew it was over for him. Just as he was about to say his last words, the fat goon shot him, and that was the end of his chapter. But was it? Soon after his death, Hyunwoo's soul was placed in the body of a boy riding in a car with his parents. His mother was worried about him and called him by the name Dajun, so he recognized that his mom was a famous actress and his dad was her simp fan who wrestled with the paparazzi. Dajun's brother was beside him and said he was acting funny when he slept off, and his mom felt he had a nightmare, so he told her not to be worried. She was relieved but rather shy that her little one suddenly started acting mature, but Hyunwoo understood exactly how she felt. The present time was 30 years before his death and 3 months since he reincarnated as the youngest son to one of Sunyang's heirs, and it was the youngest of the heirs who ordered his murder in the Maldives. When he was working for the Sunyang Group, Hyunwoo had never met with his current family because they were too worthless to hang out with the Sunyangs. This was blamed on their marriage, and the founder of Sunyang was furious that his son settled for the hawk to a girl but couldn't stop the marriage because she was pregnant already. While the other sons of the Sunyang Group fought like dogs for more shares in the company, Hyunwoo's parents abstained from the drama and watched from afar, so they earned his respect. Interrupting his thoughts, the car stopped at a giant mansion with enough space to house a continent, which was owned by the founder of the Sunyang Group, Yang Xiao. But after his death, the chairman Naman and Yunkin took over, and when Hyunwoo first got a job there, he was forced to weed the garden. Presently, they were visiting to celebrate Yang Xiao's birthday, but as soon as they walked in, people stared menacingly at them and started gossiping about them, with the family ignoring their existence. They walked into the house where Dajun's aunts and uncles sat waiting for their father, even though everyone just wanted the old man to kick the bucket so they'd grab their share of his money. One of the ugly dolls suddenly started yelling at them for arriving so late, but Dajun recognized the old hag's face from his past life. As his father apologized to her, Dajun suddenly remembered where he'd seen her. She was apparently a wasted cougar whose destiny was chasing young men and getting STDs even at 70, but her bad temperament had been the same for ages. The memories made Dajun snicker, and she got mad at him for laughing in such a serious situation. However, he said he didn't laugh, and she called him out for lying to her. Her brother told her to calm down, but she insisted that Dajun was lying to her. Suddenly, Yongcheol showed up and asked who was silly enough to disturb the peace of his house. so both parties became silent on the spot, with fear gripping every member of that household. This man had such an aura that even his kids were scared as heck, obviously because if they messed up, they could go from trust fund babies to poor dudes like you. But for Dojun, this was the very first time he would encounter his grandfather, because he never met him in his past life as Hyunwoo. Dojun's parents bowed and greeted the old man, while Dojun's brother hid behind, following the stigma surrounding his birth. Dojun couldn't care less though, at the start, but he got into a staring competition with the old man and soon almost peed his pants. However, his grandpa suddenly referred to him with fondness, asking why he never visited more often. The old man even said he had a present for Dojun, and obviously this made his children jealous and wary of the boy, much so that his parents were shocked. Later, Yongchul blew on his birthday candles and was wished a happy birthday by his family, including those who wanted him to die already. However, Dojun observed how his mum had been transformed into a maid, and even the wretched aunt was sending her on errands, among the others. One was even asking her to get back to slaving as if she was just wasting her life on YouTube shorts. This made him angry as he noticed that there were over 10 domestic staff, but they were just pushing his mum around. Later, she walked up to him and fixed his button, smiling at him as she called him her handsome son. Suddenly, someone called out to her and said she should get to washing the dishes if the food was finished, so she obediently agreed to do it. However, Dojun wasn't cool with this and was determined to ensure that his mum would be treated properly. But he was also upset with his grandpa because he treated even his parents coldly. Much later, the grandpa said he'd prepared a horse as a present for Dojun, but the boy was disappointed to find that the horse was all silicone and Botox like your crush. Anyway, what mattered right now was that the cold Yongcheol was suddenly being so nice to Dojun and only to him. Dojun wondered if this was a guilt conscience the old man was having about maltreating Dojun's father, so he decided to test just how much the old man liked him. Dojun told his grandpa that he preferred real horses to that crappy plastic thing he bought, and the old man was taken aback. He went on to say that he preferred real cars to toy cars and real boats to toy boats. Seeing the hard expression on his grandpa's face, Dojun felt he'd overdone it, and the grandpa asked him if he knew what real stuff meant. Knowing it'll be better to answer like a kid, Dojun simply said that real stuff, whether things were made by his grandpa, and that he liked the real cars, ships, and televisions made by his grandpa because those were real. A moment of silence ensued and Dojun was curious to see his grandpa's reaction. Rather calmly, the old man told Dojun that getting the real stuff would entail hard work and some scary experiences, but he'd be good if he liked fake stuff. Dojun laughed at the attempt to fool his childish appearance, and his gramps struck a deal with him, saying he'd get a real horse on his next birthday if he aced all his subjects for a year. This was rather funny to Dojun because it was like saying a Harvard graduate can't get all as in kindergarten. Even worse, he looked at Dojun and said he lacked confidence, but Dojun only had a smirk on his face and confirmed that all his grandpa wanted was for him to get straight A's. Later, when he went back outside, a young relative invited him on their grandpa's orders to the playroom, but that face gave him PTSD and took him back to the day he died in the Maldives. It turns out that this young man was the same farthead who claimed he trusted Hyunwoo over his own wife and still ended up ordering his death. While the other kids flocked around him, Dojun was pissed with him and had to remind himself that he was no longer Hyunwoo but Dojun. Later, his cousins all went into the playroom and started fighting over the dumb plastic horse, so one frog-brained boy hopped onto the horse and kept behaving like a dum-dum. It seemed Dojun's brother also understood this brat's behavior, and the entire family had gotten used to it. However, Dojun didn't care and wasn't about to settle for that behavior, so he walked up to the turd and boldly claimed that the horse was his. However, the boy didn't care if it belonged to the Pope because he could do as he pleased. Although the other kids supported him, Dojun didn't care and kicked the pole attaching the horse, after which it fell with the brat, who immediately started screaming about his leg. The terrified young ones went to seek out older ones to intervene while Bratty bawled his silly eyes out, and Dojun boldly warned him never to touch anything that belonged to him. The boy's mum came in with some others and she addressed him by the name Kangjun. Meanwhile, Dojun's mum seemed shocked to see what her boy had done, but suddenly, Kangjun's mum slapped him, calling him a complete nutcase. She slapped him over and over again, but Dojun had no words for that sad hoe. However, his mum soon stepped in and protected him from the angry woman, who told her to get out the way. The enraged woman only got more furious, so she raised her hands and was about to hit Dajun's mother when Yangqiol's voice roared through the halls, asking what the heck was happening. She was ashamed of herself before her father, but he told her to stop creating a scene and take him to the hospital. He then stared hard at Dajun and his mum, instructing everyone to leave him and Dajun alone. When the mum left, Dajun's grandpa asked if he really did that, and he said yes, so he got reprimanded for doing something so dangerous. Dajun replied that the horse belonged to him as a gift from his beloved grandpa, but Kangjun stole it, and instead of having anyone take it, he chose to break it. The grandpa was surprised to hear that Dajun did all that just to prevent anyone from having his horse, and even though there was some tension in the air, he broke a slight smile. Of course, Dajun knew the old man would appreciate such evil spite because he was otherwise known as Osama bin Yangqiol. The grandpa said he knew Dajun didn't mean to hurt his cousin, but as a result of his actions, he'll certainly get punished. He then asked him to follow him, and Dajun was led to a large library with corporately dressed influential men who presided over the decision-making of the Sunyang group. Apparently, in Hyunwoo's lifetime of slaving for this forsaken family, this was the very first time he was granted the opportunity to see Yangqiol's library. At the library, Dajun was punished to kneel while the meeting was going on. He observed that one of his older cousins, Youngjun, was present at such a prestigious meeting at his age, which means he could be the successor. Anyway, Dajun's grandpa asked them for their insights into an ongoing matter, and one of them spoke up, referring to a certain old man's persevering nature, which make him attack them head-on. Yangqiol thought for a second and mentioned something about the army, but Dajun was just as confused as we all were about the topic at hand. Someone else spoke up about a large gathering of people, and when joined by the army, they become even more aggressive. Now the founder was angry and asked if this meant his company was just to wait for the government to fall apart, and he asked if they were certain about where next the president would come from. Someone said it might, but his unsure response pissed Yangqiol, who just wanted to know for sure where he stood. He asked one of the two men who framed Dajun in his past life, and the older one of them said he was certain the government wouldn't collapse because every now and then people would protest. The others agreed with him, but Dajun found their naivety strange because he knew that in 3 days, the president of the country would declare a surrender to the opposition. It was also rather disappointing that they weren't discussing management strategies to cope with change, which was probably why Yangqiol got fed up and permitted them to leave. Next, he told Dajun to get up, and the boy struggled to walk straight. But his grandpa surprisingly was proud of him because he could withstand pain that much without fidgeting. But little did he know that Dajun had iron knees like Megan Thee Stallion. He asked why it seemed Dajun had changed so much, but the boy shared that he was tired of tolerating stuff and had just been doing it because his mom and dad were being careful with the others. Now, he'd had enough of the crap treatment and simply won't take it anymore. He was about to add a few tears for the Netflix effect, but before he knew it, his grandpa knelt to hug him. Dajun decided to give him another shock and said he should befriend all 3 of them. The shocked man withdrew and asked what he meant by that, and Dajun referred him back to his discussion with the board members. He continued by saying that since the president was the strongest party, it wouldn't hurt to befriend all 3 parties since either of them could become president. At that point, Dojun had taken his grandpa through all the stages of evolution, but he soon broke out a smile and agreed that it was better to have friends. Then he burst out laughing satisfactorily. After, he asked Dajun to play outside and call Youngjun, but as Dajun left with a look of accomplishment, the old man had a concerned look eye on his face. Soon after, Yangqiol called his secretary to be nice to all 3 presidential candidates and tell each of them that he wishes for a better situation in the country. On his own, he was proud of Dojun's profound wisdom despite his age. By just then, his grandson, Youngjun, came in. The old man said he noticed how quiet the young man was, even though it was obvious he had thoughts of his own, so he was asking for his opinion, not as a chairman but as his grandfather. Nervously, Youngjun shared his irrelevant thoughts on who he felt was more likely to become the next president, so his grandpa said he'd certainly have to trust that person chosen by his grandson. But the boy suddenly started fidgeting and sweating like he was asked to prove that the earth is flat. This somewhat irritated his grandpa, who immediately remembered how confident Dajun looked when he was presenting his suggestions. He quickly dismissed Youngjun, and as he reclined back in his chair, he wished that Dojun didn't have to be the youngest of them. Also, Youngjun sadly turned to leave in embarrassment, and Dajun had a mischievous smirk on his face. Later, as they drove back, Dajun's father shared that his father offered to invest more in educating Dajun and his brother, but he cautioned Dojun for his wrongdoing earlier. Dojun apologized, and he shared that their grandma also said he'd send them tutors. Dojun's older brother, Sangjun, wasn't particularly excited about having tutors, but Dojun had no reaction, even though he was certainly not in need of any tutor. However, it was the chairman's instructions, so he agreed to take lessons. Sangjun leaned closer to Dojun to tell him that he did a good thing, making that brat Kangjun cry. The next scene started with an official press conference delivered by the country's president, and Dojun wondered how his grandpa would react to the new situation. But surprisingly, when he returned from school, he learned that his grandfather was waiting for him. Inside, Dojun's mum was sharing that she's never wanted any of his company's shares, and Dojun's father felt the same way. This somewhat displeased him, and he scowled at her, but she humbly explained that she understood his request for her to assist Dojun in the company's work. Besides, Dojun was too young for that, and she wanted to let him grow and be mature enough to make his own decisions. The angry old man asked her if she was dumb or what, knowing what it meant to receive shares in his company, because this was a chance for them to be redeemed as his children, which he had kicked out. But now she was throwing away that chance. She humbly apologized and said she only wanted her son to grow up doing what he truly wanted to do with his life. The old man was now more enraged than before, but Dojun suddenly came in and interrupted the conversation. He warmly opened his arms to welcome Dojun as his precious little one, and then lifted him up, asking him about school and all. Dojun asked him if he was upset about something, but the lying old man said he wasn't, and blamed it on his voice being louder than megaphones. His mother also said the same thing, not knowing that her 10-year-old son has twice her ick. Anyway, he told both parties not to argue because of him and agreed with his mum, saying he'd live as he desired until adulthood. The old man looked sad and disappointed, but Dojun went on to finish his statement, saying he wanted to be the chairman of a big company just like his grandfather. The old man's eyes lit up with shock, and he laughed heartily, saying Dojun just had to follow in the footsteps of his predecessors. He turned to his daughter-in-law, feeling good for having Dojun on his side, and pleased that his grandson also wanted to be an executive. The poor woman became teary-eyed and offered to bring her father-in-law some tea. He told her to meet him in Dojun's room because he had some things to discuss with his grandson. Meanwhile, Dojun had seen his mother almost crying and thought it had to be because his grandfather finally addressed her as his daughter instead of in the rude manner he usually did. Later, Yongcheol reminded Dojun of what he said a few days back about making all three presidential candidates his friends, and shared that he sent gifts to all three of them to foster better relationships with each of them. However, something had changed that very day, as 2 out of the 3 parties teamed up against the president, so the situation was chaotic. This time around, he'd have to pick a side instead of making friends with all 3 of them as they'd planned. However, Dojun innocently asked if the new coalition between the second and third parties would yield a president and vice president, but he said no, because there was no vice president in their country. This made him ask why then they would join hands if there was no position for a vice president in the first place, and that in the end, it was only one of them who would become the president. Suddenly, Yongcheol realized that the coalition wouldn't happen because it was pointless, and the 2 opponents won't really help each other. Dojun obviously knew this from before, as both leaders didn't actually unite at the end. However, his grandpa found it weird that he and a bunch of other grown-ups couldn't see the obvious deceit, but his grandson could see the element of human greed at play. Impressed, he marveled at Dujon's intelligence and patted him on the head. Much later, Dujon went on a trip to a place called Dangjin, which he described to his parents as a place of geographic importance he read about in his textbook. However, his curiosity wasn't the real reason why he was headed there, and he really just wanted to see the place he grew up in when he was Hyunwoo. However, he wondered how to communicate with his former parents, and he soon became emotional when he saw them. Hyunwoo's mother stepped out and asked what was wrong, but she wordlessly stared at her, so his father asked what was up. They thought he was lost, but he explained that he came to find a friend named Hyunwoo. However, they both claimed there was no kid who went by such a name, and they could ask a certain Hyunji if there was any classmate going by the name. Dujon was confused, so they explained that Hyunji was their daughter. Hearing this suddenly made sense to Dujon because there was no one who went by the name Hyunwoo because he didn't exist in this world. Days later, the presidential election results were out, and it turns out that everything panned out exactly as Dojun had advised his grandpa, who felt lucky that he actually listened to the boy, whose ideas had ultimately saved his company. Dojun on his own also recognized that the current happenings were just as they happened during his past life. but that didn't mean he could let his guard down. After all, he just confirmed that Hyunwoo's body doesn't exist in this world. So many other things about the future could be different too. In fact, the first change he noticed was that the chairman of Sunyang had grown to like him in his lifetime. Unfortunately, since the future could change, it means Dajun's secret superpower might be meaningless. Anyway, before 20, he hoped to find a company that'll swallow up the Sunyang group, because only 10 years from now, Dajun's grandfather would be withering away on his hospital bed, waiting for an inevitable death. Before then, Dajun planned to move as many shares of the company to his father's possession so that they can compete against his godfather, Youngie. Most importantly, Dojun would have to prevent his own death in a car accident before his 20th birthday. While he lived as Hyunwoo, Dajun remembered hearing about the accident, which claimed not only Dajun's life but the entire family. But no one cared since they weren't relevant to the other family members, and for that reason, even he couldn't recall any detail about the car crash. But for now, he had to prevent his own death, and he wondered if helping his grandfather to live a bit longer could significantly change the future. As he finished dressing, Dajun's mum knocked to inform him that it was time for his appointment. Later, he arrived at his grandpa's place and ran to hug the excited old man. Dajun wondered if Yongcheol just wanted them to enjoy a private moment together, following the recent news that came out just as he predicted. With a smile, Dojun asked if something good happened, and the old man smiled, saying he was just happy to see Dajun and was going to get him any treat or toy he could ever want. The young one asked if this was because Yongcheol saw his grades, but his grandpa knew nothing about it and must have forgotten his initial promise to Dajun. Anyway, Dajun said he aced all his subjects with a 100% score in all of them. This made Yang so happy that he burst out laughing heartily and wished he could even buy Dojun a real horse already. However, Dajun couldn't care less about stinky horses when he had Bugattis at his disposal. He calmed his old man and said he could get the horse much later after he'd learned horse riding. Anyway, he asked his grandpa why he summoned him if it wasn't to fulfill the promise he made earlier, and the old man shared that Dojun's advice had contributed to making the company larger than before and increasing their earning power. The smart chap asked if that meant his grandpa could get him better things than a dumb horse, and the man said yes and was in the middle of making better suggestions when they were interrupted by the domestic staff who wheeled in all sorts of goodies. While they ate, Dajun's grandpa offered to build him a pasture to ride his new horse, and that was exactly what the sneaky little man wanted to hear. So he expressed his delight and ran to hug his grandpa. Things were going according to plan for Dajun, so he asked for the possible location of the pasture, and the grandpa mentioned some dumb place that Dajun didn't dig. His expression showed his grandpa that he didn't like it, but Dajun said he did, only that it was too far from his house. The old man called him a picky little one, but he said they had no pastures down south. However, Dajun suggested that they could make one because his grandpa was great at making stuff. For some weird reason, the statement made the old man burst out, and he shared that he only personally purchased 19 out of 48 branches of his company, and the rest were taken over. Dajun was shocked to hear that, but his grandpa shared that he needed vital connections to grow. However, he was willing to help Dajun on his feet. He called out to his workers to fetch him a map of the city, and this was obviously good news to Dajun. When the employee bought the map, Dajun's grandpa decided to test his perception, so he handed him a pen and permitted him to mark the area where he wanted the pasture. This was the start of Dajun's long-term goal to create several pastures globally, so he had to select areas where land would appreciate in value. The old man urged him to make a careful choice because the city center was off limits and he'd have to avoid the downtown areas. Soon, Dajun made his choice, even though it was far from his home, so the grandpa asked his guy to assess the land's status and conditions. When they were alone, Yongcheol asked Dajun whether he had any friends, but Dajun couldn't explain how he would rather be in airplane mode than say hi to anyone. His buns were saved when the employee returned to report that the land Dajun chose was really fertile but had terrible infrastructure, so only broke donkeys like you could live there. After thinking for a while, the grandpa said it wouldn't be hard to create a pasture there, and Dajun swallowed hard, waiting for his final decision. Eventually, Yongcheol ordered the employee to find purchasable land in units your decomposed brain can't comprehend. That was a win for Dajun, but his grandpa said the land was filthy and not exactly something he'd purchase because it would take a lot of time for the land's value to appreciate. But it was going to act as savings for Dajun since he'd be old enough to witness his land appreciate in value in the next 20 to 30 years. But most shockingly, only Dajin knew that the land area he chose was going to be a renowned city in the next 2 years, and he'd have a fat share of 50,000 acres of land. The next day, Yongcheol was approached by his daughter, who brought a candidate soliciting his support, with the aim of strengthening her father's relationships with the middle class. However, he wasn't willing to waste expenditure on the election because it was also already easy for them to win. This horrified his daughter, who thought he meant that the candidate wasn't worth being spent on. But he said Choi already wasted his chances because he thought he had arrived. The old fool apologized, but Yongcheol's outrageous daughter angrily said the guy didn't deserve such treatment because he came from the very best family of lawyers. Her name statement made her father smile as he reminded them that it was with his own money he made that man the chief prosecutor of Korea, but it was mostly because he needed a dog to clean after their messes. Choi was upset but tried to maintain his cool, and Yongcheol warned him to stop being greedy and act like the good dog he was. Next, he turned to his daughter Seoyun and asked to give her the audacity to act out of her role as a department store owner. She was surprised that he knew her plans because apparently she planned for Choi, her husband, to get into political power, eliminate her brothers one after the other, and have the Sunyang group all for themselves. She apologized and sought his forgiveness, and then he told her to be happy where she was because she could get replaced in minutes. All the while, Dajin had been watching with a smirk on his face because he was glad that the greedy couple was served on the spot. After the ruckus, Yongcheol asked Dajin if he was bored, but the young one claimed he was busy reading, so his grandpa urged him to keep it up. He then pushed him an envelope that contained the local documents for the land he wanted. Apparently, they had given him up to 80,000 acres, and even though this pleased Dajin, he asked his grandfather why it exceeded the 50,000 acres he initially promised. The grandpa was obviously impressed with Dajin's accurate recollection of the number, but that was deliberate because Dajin wanted to prove his management skills. The grandfather explained the reason for the increase in quantity, but this meant he would be getting approximately 16 billion won in about 2 years. He hugged his grandpa, who certainly didn't know just how much his gift meant to him. Fast forward to a year later, when the capital city, Seoul, became overcrowded and housing became expensive. The government had no choice but to expand and create more affordable housing by constructing a new city. The chosen location turned out to be none other than Bundang, which Dujan had chosen. As his grandfather saw the news, he was shocked and reminded his secretary Lee that the pasture he created for Dujan a year ago was now located in the construction area of the new city. Essentially speaking, he had hardly gone by and Dujan was already 100 times more rich in real estate. His grandfather confessed that he was the dude who exchanged his bitcoins for a slimy pizza, while his grandson, Dujan, was so sure about that land and stuck to his decision. Now he instructed Lee to take care of his grandson if he grew to be a decent boy, and in the event that he allocated about 4 of these companies to the young lad, Lee should ensure that the other greedy children wouldn't steal them. Meanwhile, Dujan was excited because he was now 140 billion won richer due to his wisdom and investments. While he was celebrating his win, his parents interrupted him and requested a talk to him. They asked him what he planned to do with his money, and he claimed he was going to save it at the bank, even though he just wanted to splurge it in Ibiza. That impressed them, but Mom asked if he wanted to buy anything, and he said she had always gotten him everything he wanted, so instead he asked his parents if there was anything they would like to do with the money. They were both shocked and surprised, and his father had a weird look, so he walked out of the room without saying a word. This made Dujan wonder where he went wrong, but his mother explained that the dad was only surprised at his response. She met her husband and explained that the young lad was only speaking immaturely, but he had good intentions. However, the man said he wasn't angry, but rather embarrassed because when Dajin offered them his money, he could only think of finally paying for that Feed Finder subscription. However, his wife smiled and said she felt the same way because that's such a huge sum of money, and it could relocate the entire family abroad. It turns out Dujan was eavesdropping on their conversation and knew just how much his parents loved them. Much later, Dujan walked up to his father and apologized for earlier, but the man said he was only surprised and asked what Dajin's future plans were. He straight up said that he wanted to become the chairman of a company even bigger than his grandfather's, and this shocked his father, who later broke into laughter. Dajin understood why he was laughing because Sunyang Group was the #1 company in their country, and he felt Dajin's dreams were much bigger than his tiny meatballs. Unfazed, the boy asked his father to help him realize the dream, but the man said there wasn't much he could do to help Dojin because he was uninterested in managing companies despite his management degree, and he'd rather binge-watch movies. The boy then asked his father if he had friends he studied with, but this visibly surprised the man and made him sit up. Meanwhile, one of Dojin's uncles heard about his financial success in real estate and was so hot-headed that he could roast a barbecue on his scalp. Youngkin didn't even hide his jealousy and said Dojin could now afford to buy 20 apartments monthly if he wanted. However, Jang was upset about his lack of seriousness because the chairman was so greedy he wouldn't give a dime for free, yet he could gift a pasture to Dojin. This made Youngkin sober and Jang continued, saying that the chairman, who was his grandpa, had never given him an acre of land or a bank account, meaning he never really rated him to begin with. He ended his statement by calling Youngkin a pathetic wet rag, and as he sighed, he decided to keep an eye on Dojin's family. At Dojin's house, his father introduced him to a friend of his who also studied management, and the man introduced himself as Seyon, the representative of a reputable company. From his past life knowledge, Dujan remembered that the man became a super asset management company. Seyon asked his friend to excuse him for some privacy with Dojin, and before he left, he advised his son to add her to the man's instructions. When they were alone, the man confirmed what he heard from Dojin's father about his ambition to become a businessman, like his grandfather. But Dojin stopped him midway, saying he wanted to be a businessman greater than his grandfather. Casually, Seyon said he was greedy, but Dojin said he was just a dreamer and asked if the man was the boss of a large company. Seyon said he was, and he was one who helped the rich get richer and got to meet a lot of rich folks. Dojin asked if he could help make him richer, but the man said he was only going to talk briefly with him because a tiny thing like himself couldn't be his client because all his clients were wealthy. However, Dojin told him he had about 14 billion won in his bank account, and after selling his leftover acres, he'd have 10 billion more. The man looked shocked like he'd seen a ghost and couldn't believe that Dojin had 40 billion in his name. He immediately looked humble and Dojin presented him with an investment plan he came up with. This surprised the man, but he was even more shocked when he went through the business plan. He even started sweating because it was way out of Dojin's league to think like that, and he confessed that even university students wouldn't be that excellent. However, Dojin boasted that university students weren't as fortunate as himself, and neither did they have dreams as big as his own. Besides, he stayed beside his grandfather, learning and understanding more about business from him. This made Seyon ask if Dojin was influenced by his grandfather, and he smiled, saying he was always beside his grandfather who would discuss really important things in his presence. The man felt chills rush down his spine and he swallowed hard, and after the meeting with Dojin, Seyon asked his friend why he didn't mention anything about Dojin's 14 billion won. Obviously, he just realized that Dojin wasn't an ordinary kid, but rather a genius. Dojin's father thought it was all about his son's grades at school, but Seyon knew very well what he was saying. Anyway, he defeatedly walked away as he planned to rethink his life's decisions. Left alone, Dojin's father tried to understand why he called his son a genius, but the boy simply put this childish display on his face. Later, Seyon and Dojin reconvened to discuss more about his business plan. Because the man felt Dojin's grandpa was the mastermind of the business plan, he found it worthwhile and said Dojin won't need the investment management book he brought with him. Seyon also said by the end of the year, Dojin would have an investment company located in the States, and Seyon will personally cover the expenses. Dojin had yet another request to make, and the man was prepared to get shocked again and was sighing when Dojin's father came in, asking if his son was causing problems. However, Seyon dramatically tapped him and said he was jealous that a genius like Dojin was not his own son. In summary, Dojin said he'd only use 10 billion of the money, and he planned to start a movie production company with the remaining 4 billion so his dad would become the CEO. Dojin's father was taken aback because he always wanted to be the CEO at Cornhub. Seyon remarked that Dojin was a critical thinker because he knew his dad would refuse to collect any money from him, and so he decided to create a movie company just for his dad. Meanwhile, Yang Cheol's secretary, Lee, reported that Dojin was now handing out with Seyon, whom Yang recognized as a money mogul. He was surprised that his son, Yoongi, had such a friend, but Lee highlighted how impressive it was that Dojin was leaving his money to an investment company instead of leaving it in a bank as they all thought. Anyway, Yang was worried that Seyon was going to prey on Dojin's wealth, so he asked Lee to personally investigate the man. Left alone, Yang realized that Dojin was simply not satisfied with the banks, and such greed was similar to his own. Later that year, some global events were happening and everyone was engrossed in them. But for Dojun, his company had become an overnight success and he owned 98% of the shares while Saeon and his colleagues owned 2%. They took a trip to New York and Dojun marveled at how grand his company looked, even though Saeon thought it was a little shabby. He explained that he chose a cheaper building because he wanted to avoid unnecessary expenses. However, to Dojun, that shabby building was his own likely White House. Dojun named his company Fantasy Investment Inc., which Saeon thought to be a bit childish, but the young lad knew exactly why he named it as such. As he walked into the company, Saeon couldn't believe he was in his first company, the very one he planned to use to overtake the entire Sunyang group. Saeon was received by some Americans in the company, who were all smiley until they heard that Dojun was the CEO of their company. In return, he introduced them to Dojun, but they were surprised to hear him speak impeccable English. He claimed he tutored himself a bit, but Saeon noted that he sounded exactly like a Native American. This was all thanks to Dojun's efforts in his previous life, where he tried to master as many foreign languages as possible just to stand out among his colleagues. Anyway, he asked them to research a specific company which was named Martin Bell of Computers. That would be the very first company Dojun and his partners would invest in. So the Bell Martin guy was someone who, at a really young age, began inventing solutions and investing up to the stage when he built the Martin computers. After he mentioned the man's name, the surprised Saeon asked him what he knew about the man in question, and Dojun shared his knowledge of Bell Martin's childhood. However, Saeon wondered if it was wise to invest in a person merely because of their childhood story, but Dojun felt the man had the potential to bring a large sum of money to their company. When you don't upon him, he told the other employees to research thoroughly the man and his inventions. A few days later, Saeon and Dojun had an appointment with Martin Bell at a hamburger place. On the way, he told the young lad that the success of investing with Martin would be low because the company was already successful, and there was no eagerness to get investors. Dojun felt they were late, and Saeon seconded his opinion by pointing out that even the meeting spot was a casual standard and it was rather difficult to arrange the appointment. They got into the restaurant and Martin waved them while Dojun took a movement to appreciate the fifth richest man in the United States. Martin was curious about Dojun and Saeon shared that the boy was his greatest fan. He laughed heartily and told him to get right into business. So, Saeon shared that dude would like to invest in his company. However, he said they didn't need any investors because they already had enough. Saeon said they already knew that, but were hoping that he would reconsider his decision. Unfortunately, Martin was not going to budge and had faith in his perfect plan. That was where Dojun stepped in and shared that Martin's childhood reflected in Dojun's present state, and he planned to be just like Martin currently was in the future. But Martin said he was just daydreaming because he was a genius at a young age. However, Dojun shared that Martin only made $2,000 as a teen selling pictures of his tiny pickle, but Dojun made $15 million from selling real estate. This shocked Martin, and Dojun went on to share that he planned to invest his money into Martin's company. Martin was shocked and asked Saeon if Dojun was his son, but the man said Dojun was actually his boss. This further shocked Martin and burst into a peal of laughter, asking how Dojun knew he was selling stamps at a young age, but Dojun simply shared that he did some background research. Next, Martin asked how Dojun planned to become a major shareholder if Martin wasn't accepting any investments because he still owned more than half the voting rights on his company's board. However, Dojun said he knew the company would go to hell in a year's time and their stocks would be so low that he'd buy them off, becoming a major shareholder in no time. However, if Martin accepts their investment, they'll give him all their voting rights until he sells their stock. Seeing that this boy was going on a rampage, Saeon advised him not to make such decisions on his own and started doing some basic math. After observing the two, Martin realized that Dojun was really Saeon's boss and asked for his name, which he presented as Howard Jean. He then said he was interested in talking some more, but this shocked Saeon. They successfully concluded the meeting, and Saeon said they might be left over from the $15 million investment. So Dojun advised him to bring up another investment opportunity and he'll decide. Next, Saeon shared his surprise at how incredible Dojun's conversation with Martin was, and his intelligence surpassed his age. Without hesitation, Dojun confessed that he only reincarnated into his current body, but had the brain of a 40-year-old. It seemed Saeon was about to buy it, but he simply thought it was a script only Steven Spielberg could execute. However, he wished that it was true because that was the only viable explanation for Dojun's exceptional brilliance. Meanwhile, Lee reported his findings about Dojun and Seon's trip, saying it was mostly a business trip. However, he also shared that Yoongi, Dojun's father, was establishing a film production company that was in its final stages. Hearing this, the chairman was enraged, mostly because that was with Dojun's money of about 4 billion won, the equivalent of almost $3 million. He felt this was a foolish attempt at shallow recognition by Dojun, because investing in Yoongi was a hopeless venture. However, Lee felt this might be a successful move, but the old man said Yoongi was just an unemployed potato couch who had no business knowledge. Still, Lee had his hopes on the fact that even one successful movie would be everything. Back at Dojun's house, Seon shared that they had left over $6 million from the investment with Martin Computers, and they could invest the rest in Microsoft. But Seon knew little about computers and heard it was dangerous to invest in Bill Gates because his ex-wife would have his assets. After explaining some gibberish and stuff, Dojun still wasn't sure of what to do, so he asked Seon for his opinion. He said he had a good feeling about Microsoft, and Dojun agreed to go with it. He also told him to sell the rest of his land to run the company in New York. Besides, they could use half of the proceeds and save the other half. After the meeting, Dojun thought to himself and realized he had no definite knowledge of the future and depended on newspapers. He wasn't certain which companies started worth investing in, but he was sure that for the next 30 years, his best bet was investing in Hollywood. The next day, Seon brought some investment books regarding the movie industry. Dojun found out that he missed out on an opportunity to invest in a movie, but after minutes of learning more about it, Seon felt it would be a terrible idea to invest in it. He explained that its production was already faulty, but Dojun was enthusiastic about it and said he was willing to go all out for the movie. However, Seon wasn't supportive of Dojun's decision because it felt more like a gamble, and investing in movies wasn't easy because it was hard to pull out if things went south. Dojun pleaded that this would be the last time, but the angry uncle wasn't having it and maintained a stern expression on his face. Still, Dojun wasn't going to let this chance slip away, as his company was going to make history as a film investment company, making 10 times their investment in profit. He soon switched to an assertive tone, saying it was his money and he could do whatever he wanted with it. Besides, even if all the money in Dojun's company disappeared, his grandfather was the richest man in their country, so that wasn't an issue. That was it for Seon, but he could only tame his anger and agree to do what Dojun said. After receiving the final instructions on what to do, Seon turned to leave, but Dojun's mom invited him for dinner. However, he turned it down because he was in a very terrible mood, and the boy's mom became concerned. Dojun told her not to worry at all because he knew deep within that Seon's anger would dissipate at the end of the year, since the movie they were investing in was none other than Home Alone. Will Dojun's Hollywood investment become a total disaster, or is he about to make his grandpa's company eat poop? Comment "My Holy Wood" if you'd like to find out in part 2. Leave a thumbs up if you liked the video and subscribe to the channel for similar content. As always, thanks for watching.